Yeah, exactly.
They don't know it's 9 a.m., you know?
Yeah, it's 5 o'clock
It's
somewhere.
9:18.
Oh, shit. Wow. Yeah, it's great to see you, bro.
Good to see you too, sir.
Thank
Always.
you so much for doing this, man.
Oh, yeah. Now, what is this for?
So, you know, we're in the 2023 Venice Architecture Biennale.
Right.
And Art Center's numbers, you know, and I'm curating a pavilion in the Biennale. And we decided, you remember we did it last time, you know, we did a ton of projects. And we decided for this one to have the question, the overall question we're asking be archive.
Okay.
The question of archive.
Yeah.
And all of the enigmas, and you know, there's all kinds of incredible questions about life itself.
Right.
When you ask archive, and so obviously, you know, not only we've spent a lot of time in archives, but also
Thinking about it,
working on it, you know, and all the enigmas of memory, time. So I'm super happy we're doing this.
Yeah.
And also incredible we're doing it here, our place.
Our place.
I mean,
It's
amazing. I got to thank Richie and Aiden, and I want to thank Teresa for letting us do it here at McSorley's, our place, our living archive.
Our headquarters.
Our headquarters, exactly.
Yeah, which is like ALN board meetings.
Coming here a long time.
We've been coming here a long time. I remember you serving me burgers in a bag, Richie. At lunchtime, I'd run out.
No, terrible. I mean, over the years.
That's Harry Kerwin. He's from the same town as we are. He came over with my mother's uncle in 1928. He worked in the pharmacy in 10th Street. The two of them came from Ireland, from the same village we're from. He wound up marrying Dorothy O'Connor, the woman that ran it.
The daughter of
the second owner.
Yeah.
He's from the same town as we're from. He came over with my mother's uncle. That's how we wound up coming here. He came in 1928, and he worked here, and he lived upstairs. And then he brought my uncle out in '63. So that's our.
That's the lineage.
Oh,
Yep.
connection. Well, I mean, you know.
That's the next episode.
Yeah.
Well,
it's
but-
all about archives. You
Yeah,
know?
it is. It's built into it. So, I mean, what's fascinating is, of course, I thought about the, you know, part of the enigma of the archive is that the past is now. In archive, meaning making the past present. And of course, I thought, well, McSorley's is an incredible expression of that. You know?
Right.
And it's like when you enter into
So
thanks so
much.
much, Richie.
Cheers.
Oh, boy, that is nice at 9 a.m. Tasty.
All right. Are we ready?
This idea that, well, let's say this, that all we have, you ask, like, when, you can say, where are we? You can also say, when are we? Right?
Yeah.
And when are we really is always now. It's just that now, any now, is made up of memory and anticipation. It's kind of hovering liminally between, like, not only what's happened, but how we remember what's happened.
And whether it can be remembered.
Exactly. What makes it up? And then there's some kind of anticipation of a future.
Right.
But the amazing thing is it's always in the now. And I think both that has to do with archive, question archive, and of course, just as we were just experiencing, this place has that where there's a space, there's a where, and there's a when. There's now, but the space and all of the artifacts in this living archive connect us to all kinds of other times and stories and histories and lineage.
Yeah.
And so I know, you've spent, most of your life in that question, in the archives and excavating. Archive is a site of excavation to try to understand and do the hard work of making present those paths.
Yeah. I guess just the thing that's foremost on my mind right now is a film that you've seen and people are starting to see, and that's Incident.
Mm-hmm.
And Incident's comprised of a modern day archive of the body-worn camera of police officers who were involved in a shooting in 2018. And what I find, there's many things that are compelling about the film, including the human rights issue foremostly, but it's also how the presence of the camera has impacted the police and their behavior, because this is right on the heels of a law being passed that said that all their body-worn camera is now going to be made public. Therefore, the archive is looming over them. They know that everything that they're recording and saying is going to be part of an archive that will not just be accessible to their superiors, but to the public. And therefore, it started to impact what they say and how they behave and the narrative that they create. And so, in some ways, the knowledge of an archive, the knowledge that this could reach an archive has actually changed what could be captured or what how life unfurls. You know, I've always thought of it sort of as what's compelling is that you know, the only thing that life itself is so ephemeral and it by nature can't be captured. So it's always a question of how do we mediate it and how do we put numbers on it and store it, and what happens when that happens, you know, because of course, like, we can't ever recreate this conversation just as it's happening now with the beer just having been served, and but we'll have these ghosts of it, you know. So you know, my line of research has always been what happens when it reaches these ghosts. How do these ghosts now become physical beings that also age along with us? How do they change materially, and how do they change in perception? And that's sort of been my line of regarding the archive, is that it's something that is now encased in time and now ages along with us, and we're seeing things through it. So it's an imperfect ghost or shadow, you know, but it is something that moves along with us on a different timeline or a parallel timeline.
You know, it's amazing you bring up ghosts. They've been on my mind. I think, you know, I mean, first of all, like to capture something, you know, like a photograph or a film, you know, by definition, in some way happened when it was captured, and is happening when it is experienced. You know, it has this double condition, because
Right.
every time it's perceived, it's also present tense.
Right.
And I think about ghosts because, you know, whether you believe in them or not, or see them or not,
Yeah.
but the definition of it, culturally, we have a definition, which is, you know, that you're gone and you're here. You know, I mean, if you're here,
Yeah.
then you're just, you know, you're alive, and if you're gone, you're dead. But if you're gone and here, we call it a ghost.
Right.
So, and it's like an eclipse. When you said shadow, it reminded me.
Right. No, it's
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah.
It's one world. Like an eclipse is, it's really the shadow that one world casts upon another, right? So there's this presence of absence that one, you know, like the moon or the earth or whatever, one makes upon the other, and it's really very similar to both ghosts, one world in another, and film.
Yeah.
You know, film is bringing into the present previous worlds.
And also as a shutter over that telescoping light, you know, I've always just marveled that our moon is the exact right distance that it exactly blocks out the sun. You know, it's not too close so that you don't see the ring. It's not too far so that it would be, you know, dwarfed by the sun. But it just is the perfect distance so that it creates this miraculous ring.
You know, many years ago, a guy did his thesis on that.
Oh, really?
He
Yeah.
did all these drawings, architecture student, of the movement and the, you know, how Earth moving around the sun, but then the moon moving around Earth.
Yeah.
And eventually he got to this exact point. And,
Yeah.
and I remember, gorgeous drawings. And I remember when he finished presenting John CITYX, just yelled out, "God was an architect."
Yeah.
Classic. Yeah. But I think, your work, I mean, of course, I love your work. I know pretty much all of it, in the high 90%. And I think, of course, a film of her deep engagement with the archive. And I think one of the incredibly beautiful film, one of the things that I also find very powerful about it is the autobiographical dimension of it. I mean, the amount of time you spent in archive, you could sense that fragility where love and desire and all of that is actually part of the experience of the archive. And I think that's really important. And of course, I was thinking of Sparkle Bean, this film as Frankenstein, the film itself.
So let's take those two things apart. I mean, one of them, and I think this is an interesting current, or it's something that I've pursued a lot, is when does the backstory of the archive become the story? So for Dawson City, there's all these films that got buried in the ground, and that's what comprises materially what we're watching. And that story is about how they ended up in the ground, which also encompasses a lot of other different things along the way. Interestingly, the same thing's true with Incident, in that the law that was passed to make this footage available is now, as I said, impacted the way this behavior and the narrative that's being spun. So that backstory of the archive is immaterial to what you're watching. And with the film of her, we're watching other stuff too, but we're largely trying to tell the story with the paper print collection, and that's the first and primitive film collection. And the reason why it exists is because it was so early that there was no motion picture copyright law. There was only a photographic copyright law, so this was some sort of misguided attempt to make photographic copies that could somehow be used in court to prove ownership of a motion picture by stamping them into the material two-dimensional world out of the ephemeral world. And I don't know if any lawsuit ever resolved any conflict along this, but what it did do is that it made these moving ephemeral shadows into something that we could hold, that we could store, that we could give titles and numbers to, and then could age. And so it seemed like a beautiful metaphor. Just if you could pursue this, what happened to these roles, why they came to exist, and why they were quickly forgotten and discarded. It had to do something with how we remember things, how we process things, and how we organize our thought towards protection, right? This protection of our rights and of saying this happened, and I own this, and then how that becomes, for whatever its original purposes is, it also becomes the memory, or the standard for the memory of time, and the marking of time.
It's so interesting when you think of those three examples. If you think of the law of copyright and the paper, right, and then you think of the law in Chicago with the footage, and maybe even if we go back to Dawson and that sort of, the banker and the insurance, was it insurance policies?
Well, the distributor didn't want their films to be shown more than times than it was been rented, so they charged the bank manager with the idea of, like, you show it once and then you store it,
right?
And then he asked him, well, now what do we do? We have all these flammable time bombs in our library. We'll just throw them away, And so they'd always been throwing them in the river, and he started, like, He said, that's not environmentally correct. Finally, he had this kind of moment of, we can't keep throwing stuff in the river. And when they would build bonfires, other buildings, it's so hot, the big nitrate fire would burn other buildings down.
Yeah.
No one could get near it. They couldn't control it. So he had this built-in landfill project, which was to fill in the swimming pool so that it finally would be solid underneath instead of hollow underneath, so that they would have a smooth rink. Hockey rules everything in Canada.
But it's so fascinating because when you were talking about the impact on the actions, and
Right.
I would even say acting of
acting.
the police,
Yeah.
right? They're acting differently within, and now we can bring that to the film firm. We can bring it to Dawson in the sense that, in a way, maybe we could say that in those cases, those three laws in different ways were kind of like ghosts, meaning that shift in the paper documentation or
Right.
the copyright or the
Yeah.
incident cameras, it ended up being a kind of ghost or shadow that changed how people acted.
Right.
Like those cops are actually acting, right? It's
Yeah,
so obvious.
absolutely. Yeah. No, it's some compliance, right, to an outside force, right? Whether it's public opinion or your superiors in the police force or the distributors, who are never going to have absolutely no leverage at all. Actually, they're thousands of miles away,
Right.
but no one was going to return those films, and so they destroy them. And for all intents and purposes, he thought that's what he was doing by burying them in a swimming pool in the Yukon. And indeed, for 49 years, they sat there undiscovered. But ironically and sort of beautifully, and by the grace of God, he inadvertently created the perfect storage facility for these. There was no oxygen; it was cold. And they outlived all their other brothers and sisters and cousins. All the other copies that were running around the world were missing. Except for a few reels, and those were all unique. So
Well, and also I don't remember his name, but the gentleman who worked in the Library of Congress who blocked the fork trucks.
oh yes, Howard Walls is its real name, but he's not named in the film of her, so you're forgiven. But he's the historic figure, and sort of was really, I think, looking for a way to climb his way into some sort of status within the Library of Congress. So he did this kind of melodramatic or heroic gesture. In that time, he recognized the value of those reels and also the future of film, because as you remember. This is true in Dawson and at the Library of Congress at that time. And that's sort of, a film had was sort of like something you wrap your fish in, after you've seen it. It was a newspaper. It was absolutely, discardable, which is kind of amazing to think of when you think of the incredible, all the production that went into making it and getting it seen.
Right.
But it was absolutely disposable and, for the masses and for a yuck or two,
It's so fascinating. These are things I haven't even thought of before in your work. We're getting to, when I think of that man with the fork truck at the Library of Congress walking, and then I think of the cops in Chicago and the sort of feverish trying to rewrite the story in lifetime. And I'm going back to acting, and what I'm saying is that this thing that. But there's the legal inflections, the inflection that happened from those laws. But there's also something else about both the past and the story. Like searching, like defending the story or changing the story, or it's like a battle over what happened in all these cases.
Well, I mean, that couldn't have been more clearly illustrated than in the incident case, because one of those cameras, taken on its own, showed this guy who's been, wrongfully accosted by the cops, and he's running through the cars into the street, and he is carrying a gun, but, Illinois has a concealed carry law, and he has a FOID card. He has the right to own a gun. As it turns out, he didn't have a right to carry it, but no one should have known that. It should have been stopped. But that the police quickly released this angle of him reaching for his gun. In fact, if you show the dashboard cam mirrored up against that, locked to the same frame, he's already getting shot on at that point. There's an officer already drawn his gun, and he's in survival reflex mode at that point. So the idea of portraying him as an aggressor because he's reaching for is a construct, right? And they really effectively changed the court of public opinion by releasing that within, it's the first time the quickest they've ever released any footage, right? It was on the news that night and quickly quelled the building, outrage and protests. And he was carrying a gun. He was a guy who was reaching for a gun. There's a gun. But when you see the whole line of events, it's hard. Like, how would you know how you would react if somebody started reaching for you and God forbid, pointing a gun at you? So, it's funny because we had originally thought about this idea that you could have multiple points of view of the same incident. And this was just a narrative construct that Jamie Calvin, the journalist who originally sued for the Laquan McDonald case, and so he was the person who affected that law that this footage had to be released, and then he wrote about this case, which is how I got interested in it. We had just thought of this as a narrative construct to begin with, that like Rashomon, the same incident could be viewed from different points of view, and that and each different point of view would naturally have or could potentially have a different camera associated. So one, a bystander would have a cell phone, of course, but there'd be a closed circuit TV from somewhere else. The cop would have the body-worn camera. And each one of those archives, right, or archive makers would have a different point of view and a different media associated, a different time code, a different way of recording in a different angle. And so we always just thought, well, wouldn't that be a beautiful thing to write, just as a narrative film? And in our conversations that we have, like you and I have conversation, like, wouldn't that be cool? And then he started writing about this case, and I was like, wait a minute, that's the thing we've been fantasizing about. It already exists. There's these different views that give this different reality. By championing one view, favoring one view, you create this narrative that really, they won with that. I mean, that, the cops were never held, and it does get into that gray area with the split second, which is always going to be deferential to law,
But it's that makes me think of a point that if we think about the knowledge of these different characters, whether from the film of her, Dawson, and the officers out there, the knowledge of the record, record, inflecting their actions.
Right.
In a strange way, that brings us to Spark of Being, brings us to Frankenstein. And what I mean is, film, the mingling, the commingling, métissage, as my friend Rambo Gregarious says, the mingling of the record and life ends up creating us in a different way, right? They're acting differently. And so there is a kind of new being, like a Frankenstein, which is us. And then when you talk about, let's say, the difference between like the timing of, or I'm talking about duration and fast or slow of Dawson or Gotham or a film of her versus Incident, you get to a really complex question about the tsunami of past in the present that we're going through now.
Right. The amount of information we have, right, to flood through, right. And so that something can be lost just by the sheer volume of what's being created, right? That whereas it doesn't need to be lost because it's printed on paper.
It's a different loss, but it's lost.
Yeah.
And that, I think about this a lot when I think about the still life in life or living in the still life, these kinds of questions, the nature of our humanity. And it's not as simple as like, oh, technology is gonna change our life.
Yeah.
It's if you think about, and I don't want to go mine too deep into cognitive science and neurological traffic and all that, but think of the visual cortex and the optic nerve and like how we are recording this present tense film,
Right.
you know, with a limited number of surfaces, as my friend Chris Rose said, you know, we're absorbing and we're accepting and rejecting all these inputs at all kinds of different speeds, and I'm talking about being biological, and if you think about that, and then you think about the shift from the paper to, you know, Instagram and its 50 cousins,
Right.
changing our
Absolutely,
cognitive
yeah.
experience.
There's certainly the turn of from the 19th to the 20th century, we created a new being, right, that could think and imagine in images, and the idea that these images could be repeated. That was, you know, right, that Edison said that the phonograph was going to be able to bring back the dead, that there was just going to be an entire difference in the way we perceive not just the past, but how we related to the past. And I think that's true. I don't think there's any question that we've continued to evolve. Like we understand, we can watch movies in a different way than our parents can, right? And the next generation is very versed in video games and game culture in a way that you and I aren't, right? And could never be, right? We kind of miss that, you know, as a jump, you know, and then there's going to be something that evolves out of that, you know, Bastam can't grasp,
Exactly.
and that's all coming from this Muybridge. You know?
Exactly, from Muybridge,
Yeah.
folding the densification of the past in the present.
And the incremental recording of what's essentially fluid, right? That by breaking it down into these discrete, evenly matched frames, and then recompiling it, we can somehow feel as if we can understand this world better.
Exactly.
It's a very, I don't know, Western way of saying it.
Yeah.
And if we atomize it, we'll understand it, you know?
Exactly. We just need more.
We just need more, yeah.
More and more.
Yeah.
No, but Bill, this shift and abbreviation from paper preserve, you know, through the swimming pool, to incident, and the impact it had on how people act.
Yeah.
It brings me to this enigma I'm always wrestling with about reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, by that I mean biological reproduction and mechanical reproduction. You know, both that word, you know, obviously applies to both. And I often think, and maybe they're not so different. And what I mean is, you know, sometimes I abbreviate and say, you know, Darwin and Walter Benjamin, you know, his famous piece on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, that this will to double ourselves into the world. You know, but biologically we want to procreate, and we want to capture and make film, make photography. We want to, you know, and eventually now get to incident time, this tsunami. You know, Instagram and its 50 cousins is all like, we just want 1,000 selves, you know, doubled and discharged out into the world all the time. And I think when I think of the Frankenstein point, the spark of being, it is this, you know, we're acting differently.
Right.
And so our biological reproduction and evolution is, of course, being inflected by this other reproduction.
Until AI sets us free, right? Because we're in a very quaint few years where, like, these body-worn cameras are supposed to represent some truth, but, you know, this time next year, anyone will be able to say, well, you know, that was all, you know, AI, or, you know, of course it'll be doctored, you know.
Yeah.
So even the fact that we can assign truth to any video image now we're already showing our age, right?
Yeah.
You know.
But you know, that in addition to the technological, social, political transformations that touches on, there's a question of our biological changes that will impact. Meaning there's history, there's our lifetime, right? We're living, here we are, we're alive. And there's historical time, meaning the temporality that we happen to be. If we were in 1610, or if we were in 1864, this place is 10 years old.
Yeah.
Our lives would be different because the historical context,
There's some trees that are still around, right?
Right.
Yeah.
the threads that move through it.
Yeah.
But so our lifetime is nestled inside of a historical time. Of course, that's inside of an evolutionary time. You can go back to geologic time, cosmic time, but none of them end. The point is, there's a present tense. It's all now. You make a cut, you make a cross section like through a cabbage.
Sure.
All of those are actually now. That's
Yeah.
why a place like this becomes such a powerful experience,
Yeah.
because there is a historical time that is then and now.
And I mean, in a way, just that was part of the fascination with decay. That besides the fact that it looked cool, it was also another timeline. A timeline that was happening to the service and within the image that was newer. It was more current than the recorded image, and it was taking this time to build this
and change
additional access to and access to to change the image. And I always loved what Weschler said, even though it's not entirely true, but it took this long for this footage to look this way, that it was in some ways the most contemporary footage you could have, because it was still somehow decaying. Of course, whenever I made a reproduction of it, it stopped decaying and
Right.
continued to decay in real life, so we're looking at a snapshot of what that decay looked like and whatever.
But it's interesting. I often make the point that it's not like evolution stopped and history started.
Right.
I mean, it's
That's
all
right.
still happening. And of course, in our life, like today, we got up early, we came here. There's today as a day in our life, and that accretes and becomes our life story. So like, you're from Chicago, I'm from, and we have our families, but it's all an accretion of individual days, and then eventually you get to historic time and
Well, yeah, you think that there was a time before history, of course, before we were writing and recording things, and it was all old guys like us telling the youngsters what went down and sitting around at a place not unlike this, remembering and correcting and arguing and trying to get the story right, or singing songs or that told the story, and that was an oral history that had to be passed down. You can imagine that if it wasn't passed down, that it
would be in a void.
It would be in a complete void, right? So that social fabric had to be just so, and the rituals around telling that story about positioning. And
I think of that. There's a great Borges quote. He says the fact is that every writer creates his own precursors. His work modifies our conception of the past as it will modify the future.
Right.
So that, and of course, obviously, I think that quote very perfectly applies to your film.
What we were just talking about. Yeah. Who said it?
Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian
Borges,
writer. You also, another piece of this we're really close to with reproduction. Reproduction is the giant question of the I mean, recognize, remember, reconcile, record, revolution, reformation, relationships, right? All those re's, all the re's in the world, they're ultimately about this issue of again. To recognize something.
Or an answer, right? When you reply to an email, right? You use RE,
And we move through so many things, and it literally is a kind of blinking expression of the fact that the present is not only of the past. I'm saying that now, memory and anticipation now exists and hovering between, and so to recognize is to cognize again.
Right.
I recognize Bill, and I think there's something profound. Like I said, reproduction, biological, reproduction, mechanical. That is kind of the hinge. It's like the pin in the hinge that connects our biology and all of our forms.
And the mechanical reproduction, right? Absolutely. Yeah.
It's linking. And that is kind of moving elliptically now. If you think of the hinge as a circle, the pin, it's like gyrating the re is gyrating, which is in a way why I wanted to ask archive for the Biennale.
Yeah.
Because re and archive are directly, they're directly linked. It's like the archive in a way is a kind of place. Certainly, if you think about a living archive, like an archive that you engage, like places you go, it is a space. It's not just artifacts. It's actually a space to excavate the re, like to engage, the make present, make now. The best people working in archive, obviously you being one of them. I always love that the Smithsonian gave you that award as a historian, a creative historian, because there's no question that the creative imagination, like creating new works as a way of understanding history, is essential. And that's, I don't think there's anybody doing it at the level that you are in terms of direct engagement with archival material, but creating new works from those stories. I don't think we see that. When we do, it's usually much more, how do I put it, like a kind of linear sense of history.
Right.
Whether it's documentary or historical films, they're much more flat in the sense of telling a story, whether it has anything to do with what happened or not, that coheres in a linear way.
Well, it's so strange because sometimes I'll just be attracted to an image or a way of, depicting a reality that I see in an archive, and then as I'm working on it, lo and behold, current events conspire to make it relevant. So I was working on the Great Flood before Katrina, and God knows before Sandy, but then those two things made that story. Everyone was all suddenly talking about the 1927 flood.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
I love the film. I think I've shared this with you before, but that was one of those moments, and literally a lived epiphany I had about your work when we were up at the Museum of Modern Art. We were at MoMA, and they were screening The Great Flood, and Bill Frisell was up on stage playing guitar. And, incredible, the flood, and movement north, the birth of rock and roll, right? Yeah. The electrification of the guitar in Chicago. And I was just totally absorbed by the film, and Bill's up there playing. And then there's this insane moment that happened where in the film, you see a guy playing the guitar in 1930s in Chicago. And Bill Frisell notices and he turns and he starts to riff with the guy. And they do a duet, right? The guy in the film and Bill do a duet in present tense Museum of Modern Art. And I was just like, oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly could have found people who are more connected to the roots tradition than Bill, but he's far out on that tree, and he's coming from the same tree. So it's sort of the fact that he plays such a singular and personal style of guitar almost seemed to, emphasize, how far-reaching that tree is.
Yeah. No, that's the still life in life, and also live in the still life, meaning that, that was a moment you and I and Frisell shared, living in the still life, Oh man. Well, listen, I want to share this one paragraph, and maybe we'll I don't want to end when you're reading this.
Yeah.
I brought it just in case, because this is when I wrote the piece on Gotham, on your film Gotham.
The only person who's ever written about Gotham.
Really?
I think so.
Absolutely love that film. It's New York, man. If you ever want to know New York, Gotham is it. But I was looking through it the other day, and the last paragraph of that piece, when I read it, I was like, okay, I got to bring this paragraph for this. And funnily enough, it's called Ghosts.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So I just want to share with you, and just tell me what you think. I said, a ghost, by definition, inhabits two worlds. It must be and remain from the beyond while becoming present within the sphere of life, Like an eclipse, the presence of one sphere takes the form of a shadow within another sphere. The promise of this double condition of an eclipse lies in the capacity to make the ineffable present, to manifest the shadow of one world into another. It has given me great joy to write on my dear friend Bill Morrison's Gotham, where the past and future are made present, where change is timeless. I can almost remember the next time we will return to our cave, McSurley's old ale house, established in 1854, before Sheep's Meadow, the Cooper Union, and the Eiffel Tower, to sit together amongst the ghosts of this, our great city, and search for our water, remember the towers, and wait for those two black holes to collide.
Wow, that's beautiful, David. And it presages this moment, you know. It's incredible. Thank you.
Yeah. Cheers, Bill.
Cheers to you.
Cheers, Richie. Cheers.
Cheers. Hayden. Beautiful. I think we should end on that.
All right. I think so. Yeah, that was great.
That was great. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Bill. It was really beautiful. Wonderful. Wonderful to do it here, too.